And people ask me this kind of stuff all the time.
Yeah.
Like, what do I do? How do I sleep better? How do I stop stressing? And usually I find that people are not serious, meaning they want an answer, but they don't want to do the work.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was like, look, it's really simple. Can you not eat until 2 p.m.? I was like, yeah, I'm not hungry in the morning. I'm like, great. Drink coffee, drink water, and in the morning, get up and just get on, either run or get on some exercise bike and just pedal like someone's chasing you with a syringe full of poison. When is best to do exercise and what types of exercise to do if your goal is fat loss? The topic of exercise is a kind of controversial one, not as controversial as nutrition and diet. It's a particularly interesting one because different types of exercise engage the musculature of the body and the heart and the lungs in different ways and can have vastly different effects on things like hormones and metabolism, depending on whether or not it's of high intensity, moderate intensity, or low intensity. So rather than think about weight training versus cardiovascular exercise, I think the most simple way, the most fluid way to have this conversation about exercise and fat loss is in terms of 3 general types of training. Whether or not it's done with weights or body weight doesn't really matter. And those are high intensity interval training, something that seems to have gained a lot of popularity in recent years, so-called HIIT, H-I-I-T. So high intensity interval training, sprint interval training. So that's going to be very high intensity, or SIT, or moderate intensity continuous training, MICT. So we've got HIIT, SIT, and MICT, MICT. And we can get a little bit more precise if you'd like. I'm not somebody who measures my VO2 max or anything while I exercise. I generally know whether or not I'm doing something I could continue for a very long time or whether or not I'm doing something that I realize is going to be of short duration, high intensity. But if you'd like to map this to VO2 max, SIT, this sprint interval training, was defined as all out, greater than 100% of VO2 max bursts of activity that last 8 to 30 seconds, interspersed with less intense recovery periods. So this would be sprinting downfield for 8 to 30 seconds, then maybe walking back for about a minute or two, and then sprinting again and then continuing. So that would be SIT. HIIT, H-I-I-T, is defined as submaximal, so 80 to 100% of VO2 max bursts of activity that last 60 to 240 seconds, interspersed with less intense recovery periods. So on a standard 400-meter track, just to give this a little bit of a visual, a 4-minute mile would be fantastic for most people, although people run faster than that, of course. So that's 4 60-second laps, but that's back to back to back. 60 seconds would be about one revolution around the track, maybe 90 seconds, depending on how fast one is running. So 60 to 240 seconds. MICT, okay, this moderate intensity continuous training is steady state cardio, sometimes called zone 2 cardio these days on the internet, which is performed continuously for 20 to 60 minutes at moderate intensity of 40 to 60% of VO2 max, or if you prefer heart rate, 55 to 70% of max heart rate. Okay, so we can think about high, medium, and low intensity exercise, although low intensity usually means that you could carry on a conversation, or maybe you'd have to gasp every few steps or so while trying to talk and run. That's, I think, going to be the most useful way to have this conversation that we're having now, because there's so many different forms of exercise that people do, and intensity is important. Let's ask the question that I think many of people are wondering about, which is it better, meaning do you burn more fat if you do your exercise fasted? And fasted in this respect could be that you wake up in the morning, you've been fasting all night, you just hydrate and you exercise, or sometimes people will ingest caffeine. In any case, that would be fasted. So probably not having eaten anything for anywhere from 3 to 24 hours or maybe even more. Because you could also be fasted in the afternoon if you had lunch at noon and it's 4 or 5 or 6 p.m. Will you burn more fat if you exercise without eating anything first, without ingesting any calories first? And people have tried to really split hairs on this every which way. People say, well, you can fat fast because fat and protein doesn't lead to as great increases in insulin as other things. Maybe you can have a few almonds and then still train. And indeed, insulin will prevent fat oxidation. I want to be really clear. The burning part of fat in the cell, the movement of the fatty acid and into mitochondria and the conversion to ATP, insulin inhibits that process. However, it's been shown that at least for short periods of training, it doesn't really seem to matter whether or not you eat before training or you don't, if your goal is fat oxidation. Now, I want to put an asterisk near that because there's some exceptions, but there were several studies done that, and the kind of the classic ones of these, I'll read out to you. What they basically did is they gave people glucose, sugar, blood to increase their blood sugar before training or not. And the kind of classic study of this is Alborg et al. So 1976, so it goes way back, which is that glucose reduces fat burning in exercise. And then some other studies, if you want to look these up, they're very easy to find on PubMed. You put in Horowitz, 1999. Lee et al. Is another one where they have people drink milk with glucose in it, so sweet sugary milk before exercise, etc. And you can find a number of examples where eating before exercise reduces the amount of fat that's oxidized during the exercise. And you can also find a lot of studies showing that eating during exercise or prior to exercise will not reduce the amount of fat that's oxidized. However, the types of exercise, whether or not it was medium intensity or high intensity or low intensity, is all over the map for these studies. So it's very hard to target an ideal protocol. And then if you look really deep in the literature, you start to find meta-analyses where people have actually aggregated all the findings and some modern studies where it points to some very specific and useful protocols. And so here's the rule or the protocol that I extracted from that literature. At a period of about 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, I want to be clear, at about or after 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, there's a switchover point whereby if you ate before the exercise, you will burn far less fat from the 90-minute point onward than you would if you had gone into the training fasted. So let me repeat that. If it's moderate intensity, so-called zone 2 cardio type exercise, at the 90-minute point, if you happen to have eaten before the exercise within 1 to 3 hours prior to the exercise, then you reduce the amount of fat that you will burn from 90 minutes onward. Whereas if you had fasted prior to the exercise, you hadn't eaten anything for 3 hours or more prior to the exercise, at the 90-minute point, 90 minutes of exercise, you will start to burn more fat than you would had you eaten. Now, 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise is a lot. So that's a pretty long run. Even if you're running at a pretty slow pace, like a 10 or 12 minute mile, that's a lot of running. That's a lot of swimming. So that's a lot of walking. That's a lot of hiking. So, however, there are people who are going out hiking all day or running all day or walking all day. And if you want to burn more fat per unit time, you want to oxidize more fat, then you would do that fasted. Now, there are also studies that point to the fact that you don't have to wait to 90 minutes in order to get this enhanced fat burning effect. The studies I was able to find and that look to me like quality peer-reviewed studies with no company bias or no product bias of any kind. These are studies that were largely funded by the federal government in the university context, pointed to the fact that if one does high-intensity training or even the very high-intensity forms of training like sprints or squats or deadlifts or any kind of activity that can't be maintained for more than these, 8 or I would say up to 60 seconds. So a set of lifting weights repeated. If that's done for anywhere from 20 minutes, so weight training or powerlifting or these kinds of things or kettlebell swings, or up to 60 minutes, well, then the switchover point in which you can burn more fat if you go into that fasted comes earlier. And this makes sense because there's nothing holy about the 90-minute point for medium intensity zone 2 cardio. That 90-minute point is the point in which the body shifts over from mainly burning glycogen, basically sugar that comes from muscles or the liver, and realizes this is going on for a while. I'm going to shift over to a storage site fuel that is in reserve, like body fat. This is going to happen for a while, so I'm going to start tapping into body fat stores. Now, fat doesn't have a little brain there. It is innervated by neurons, but it doesn't have thoughts. And you don't actually control this switch with your mind. This is something that has to do with the milieu of various hormones. What has to happen is insulin has to go down far enough. So if you ate before the exercise, you'd have an increase in insulin. If you ate carbohydrates, you'd have a bigger increase in insulin. Fat and proteins indeed will have lower amounts of insulin, and fasting will give you the lowest amount of insulin. Well, then that switchover point is going to come earlier in the exercise. And if you think about it, if you were to do something high intensity for 20, 30, 40 minutes, so maybe lift weights and then get into zone 2 cardio, if you were fasted, the literature says that you're going to burn more body fat per unit time than if you had eaten before or during the exercise. So what does this mean? This means if you want to burn more body fat, if it's in your protocols and have been approved to do this safely, exercise intensely for 20 to 60 minutes. The higher the intensity, obviously, the shorter that bout is going to be, and then move over into zone 2 cardio. And if you do that fasted, or the medium intensity cardio, I should say, and if you do that fasted, then indeed you will burn a higher percentage of body fat.